Flicka by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 27. By the time the harvest moon, as yellow as saffron, rose over the dark skyline of the eastern horizon and hung there, trembling behind the pulsations of the atmosphere, there was the smell of autumn on the wind and a blanket of dazzling fresh snow on the never-summer range. When the breeze veered to the south, the smell of it blew over the ranch, alien and challenging like the startle of an unexpected fingers tapping at the door. There were different flowers in the dells and along the streams, no longer the pink and blue and white of spring and early summer, larkspur and delphinium and bluebells. Instead, feathery goldenrod, black-eyed Susans, asters, everything golden purple for the autumn. The fine weather still held, and because it was due to break any time, McLaughlin decided to hire a crew of 6 extra men and get the haying done in 3 weeks, instead of taking on only a couple of extra hands and letting the work run through September. Nell had a dozen to cook for, and she was so busy Ken had to wash and disinfect Flicka's legs by himself. The poultices were discontinued. The wounds were hard, but not open anymore. Meals for everybody were in the ranch house kitchen. No more cooking for Gus to do in the bunkhouse. Now, when there was a crew of men, Gus's position as foreman of the ranch became more than honorary. After McLaughlin, Gus was in charge, his particular responsibility being the care of the machinery, for which work, like most Swedes, he had an innate ability. Ken and Howard thought it was fun to eat in the kitchen with the hay crew. The men stamped in at mealtime with clean washed faces and hands and freshly slicked hair, and the kitchen rang with loud laughter and joshing remarks. Never a day passed without difficulties or alarms or some minor catastrophe. To begin with, the hired men were undependable, and for the first week McLaughlin was kept busy sizing up his crew, firing some, taking them to town, picking up other men, and quite as often as he himself did the firing, they fired themselves for no known reason. Just the laconic statement, "I'm quitting, boss." Okay. The proximity of the two towns, Cheyenne to the east and Laramie to the west, made the men restless. They could hear the transcontinental buses out on the Lincoln Highway, and the moment they had a few dollars in their pockets, they were in a fever to spend them. Other things happened. One day the biggest hay wagon, fully loaded, was turned too sharply by the driver and tipped over. It had to be completely unloaded, righted, then filled again. 2 good hours wasted, and McLaughlin's face as black as thunder. A team of horses, hitched to the rake, ran away and collided with the corner post of the fence, snapping the pole of the rake and injuring one of the horses. Another day, when McLaughlin had gone to town, the men tried to get the baler across the creek in Castle Rock Meadow, bridging it by means of a few heavy boards laid across. They foundered the heavy machine in the mud of one of the banks and failed to get it out during a whole morning of sweating and shouting and cursing. When McLaughlin reached the meadow at 2 in the afternoon, he found that the day so far had been wasted. Nell, who had driven down to the meadow in the car with him, waited to see how the affair came out. McLaughlin took charge. He had 2 teams of horses hitched to the baler. He had the men bring railroad ties and place them as levers behind the wheels, which were sunk in the mud. 2 men on each lever, ready to throw their weight on it when he should give the command. McLaughlin himself took the reins and the long whip, and suddenly giving the command, unleashed enough coordinated energy to upend a house. Ginger Sultan! The crack of the whip was nothing to the whip crack in his voice. The men all broke into yells and jounced their weight on the levers, and horses strained and pulled, frustrated by the great weight of the foundered machine. For long, unbearable minutes, McLaughlan lashed the horses with his whip and his voice, while the baler, with the implacable resistance of inanimate things, crouched in the mud. There was no let-up. The terrible striving and struggling was sustained without weakening, kept going by McLaughlan's will and voice and fury, until at last sweat broke out all over Nell. The worst thing was to see was the plunging and straining of the 4 horses. Suddenly the baler gave up. It tilted out of the mud and climbed the low bank to the accompaniment of yells and cheers. McLaughlan shouted, "Whoa!" The horses relaxed, trembling and heaving, and McLaughlan went to their heads and thanked them. "Good boy, Ginger. Good boy, Sultan. Well done, old Nelly, Tommy." Each one got a pat and a word of commendation, and their wide, frightened eyes, gazing at McLaughlan, became calm. McLaughlan explained to the men that the collapse of the bridge was due to the fact that they had laid the boards across the stream at an angle instead of straight. Offsetting all the difficulties and wasted hours was the fact that the weather held. McLaughlan had gambled on its holding, and for once he played in luck. A fresh wind sprang up every morning just before sunrise, increasing as the day drew on. Much of the raking and gathering of the hay, the loading of the wagons, and the stacking was done in such a smother of blowing grass that everyone's teeth were on edge. But McLaughlan was thankful. It was the wind that made the weather hold. Storms were gathering all around Sherman Hill. Great banks of clouds accumulated and compressed until, driven into themselves, they were formed into coils that were ready to explode in cloudbursts and sheets of flame if they once reached the freedom of the higher areas. When the wind died down at sunset, the edges of these cloud banks could be seen pushing up over the horizon, and during the night they hurried their pace and spread halfway over the sky, gathering themselves for attack, only to be dispersed by the bright, strong wind that came down with the dawn. McLaughlan's eye was constantly on the sky. It was not often that a rancher got plenty of water in the early part of summer when the grass was growing, and then dry weather for the haying. He drove himself and the men. At mealtimes, the conversation turned to politics and economics, as is the case whenever groups of farm workers are gathered together. And then McLaughlan would remember that a good crop often meant not wealth, but poverty to the producers, and he would launch himself on a bitter tirade. "A good crop," he shouted, "yes, so what? So the price of hay goes down till a man can't sell his surplus and break even on the cost of putting it up. I tell you, all this talk of our economic difficulties, the snake in the woodpile is the law of supply and demand. It's cockeyed." "How do you make that out, boss?" asked Tim. "Because when you're rich, you're poor. This whole country rich as Croesus and on relief. Is that cockeyed, or is it? Take this county, for example. Suppose we have fine weather, fine crops, all the stock in good shape. Now, that's wealth, real wealth. But what's the result? Counted in dollars, we're poor. Sometimes the best crops make a man the poorest. If I should have a good crop of hay here, by chance of freaky weather conditions, as sometimes happens, and everyone around have bad luck, cut their hay at the wrong time, or something like that, then I have to be tickled, because I've got the hay when no one else has, and I can boost the price, and charge more and more, when my neighbours are broke, and their animals starving, and they have to come to me and buy at my price, and mortgage everything they've got to pay me. That's the year I ought to sell low, but that's the year I sell high. Anything that works out as wrong as that in practice has to be wrong in theory. Years when we have natural wealth and abundance, we ought to have money in the bank and be able to pay our bills and send our children to college. Do away with the law of supply and demand, and you do away with a whole lot else," said old Harvey. "You'd have to have fixed prices, for one thing, no more competition. And no more trusts and monopolies, neither. McLaughlan pounded his point home. The harder you work, the better you do your job. The more success you have, the worse off you are. Treat a horse that way, and what would you make of him? It would usually be Gus who would cut the argument short, rise from the table, and summon the gang out to their work. McLaughlan had neither the time nor patience to help Ken with Flicka. Or, thought Ken, was it because she had cost him that $10 for the serum that he was so short and irritable? When Ken bothered him to know what he should do next with the filly, McLaughlan roared, "Oh, do anything with her you want. Lead her around. Get her used to the corrals and the stables." So Ken led the filly by the halter and lead rope, into the pens and corrals, up through the gorge into the horse corrals, where she had been caught. When he first tried to get her through the door of the stable, she halted, and Ken did not force her. He stood at the door with her and finally left her there and went in alone and poured some oats into the manger for her. That did the trick. She walked in of her own accord, and when she had eaten her oats, became curious and investigated every corner of the barn. Together they made the rounds, Ken at her head, discussing what they saw. Everyone at the ranch got used to the sight of the boy leading the little golden mare around. She used 3 legs and held up the 4th. The wound on the foreleg was hard and swollen, but did not seem to pain her. Both the boys had to spend part of each day in the haying field. There were many ways in which they could be of assistance. When the hay was being tossed from the little piles into the hay wagon, to be carried to the big stack and dumped there, the boys could stand in the wagon, tramping the hay down, and distributing it with pitchforks, so that it would load more evenly. There were endless running of errands and fetching and carrying to be done on Highboy and Cigarette. "Howard, see this little bolt? Go up to the tool house, and on the shelf over the window you'll see an old coffee can, and pick out some more bolts like this and bring them." Or, "Ken, ride up to the house and tell your mother to fix up the dinner and bring it down here in the car to us at noontime." Or, "Go tell your mother we need some first aid here, a man's got a bad cut. Tell her to hurry down in the car." Howard spent the whole day with the hay crew, but Ken, when he was let off, hurried back to Flicka in her nursery. He was beginning to have a feeling of pressure. Here it was almost September. School began the 15th. Only a couple of weeks more to spend with Flicka. Standing at the filly's head so he could talk to her and look into her eyes, he thought about it, and it was appalling. Why, the whole summer was gone. Back in school soon, without Flicka, living apart from her for many months, not seeing her, not even knowing what she was doing, how she was looking, what she was learning, bad tricks or good. He knew that he had to take it like a man. It was part of the price he paid for Flicka. There was also the composition. He was writing it. He brought his copybook down to Flicka's nursery and sat on the side of the little hill between the trunks of the cottonwood trees and worked on it, and read bits of it aloud to her. It needed to be only a few pages long. Making it up was not hard. There was plenty to say, but it was hard to get the spelling right and the punctuation. When it was finished, he would copy it at the desk in his room so that the penmanship would be perfect. "This," he said proudly to Flicka, "is a $300 composition, Flicka. Dad gave you to me, Flicka, and I'm giving him $300. So you could say, I'm paying for you. That's a pretty good price for a little yearling filly. But I'll have to take $10 off that for the shot of serum." Sitting nibbling the end of his pencil, his thoughts concerned with the story of Gypsy. His eyes were on Flicka, and it seemed to him that her ribs were showing. It was the first time he had noticed that. She ate her oats, she grazed, but she certainly was thinner than when she had been brought in off the range, thinner even than she had been a week or 2 ago. He spoke about it to his father. Rob glared at him. "Do you give her oats twice a day?" "Sure." "Does she clean 'em up?" "Yes." "All right then." "But Dad." Would you come and look at her?" "No, don't bother me about her." Ken went back to Flicka and his copybook and pencil, but when he looked at her, his eyes were troubled. The wound seemed neither better nor worse, hard and dry and somewhat swollen, but certainly she had lost flesh. Everyone is thin, thought Ken, after an illness, and Flicka had been ill a long time. She would pick up gradually, the way grown people did, when her sickness was quite over. Besides the wounds, there was that thing his father had said, an infection of the bloodstream. That means she was sick all the way through. She had a lot to get over. That's the end of chapter 27. Good night.